We're totally booked.
Rock and roll!
Well, I think I'll leave you to your reading.
Little Hand says it's time to rock and roll.
Rock and roller!
We are totally booked.
Welcome back to the Booked on Rock podcast. The website bookedonrock.com. Find a listing of all the podcast platforms where you can listen, subscribe, and give us a 5-star review. That is a huge help. Gets us out to more listeners. I always say there are people that don't know this podcast even exists. So if you get those 5-star reviews out there and you subscribe, that's going to help the podcast out a lot. And thanks to everybody who have subscribed and given your reviews. It is much appreciated. James Campion, he is our guest this week to talk about his book, Take a Sad Song, The Emotional Currency of Hey Jude, which will be released on June 1st through Backbeat Books. In Take a Sad Song, The Emotional Currency of Hey Jude, James Campion dives deeply into the song's origins, recording, visual presentation, impact, and eventual influence, while also discovering what makes Hey Jude a classic musical expression of personal comfort and societal unity, conceived by a master songwriter, Paul McCartney. Within its melodic brilliance and lyrical touchstones of empathy and nostalgia resides McCartney's personal and professional relationship with his childhood friend and songwriting partner, John Lennon, and their simultaneous pursuit of the women who would complete them. There are also clues to the growing turmoil within the Beatles and their splintering generation scarred by war, assassination, and virulent protest. Campion's journey into the song includes the insights of experts in the fields of musicology, sociology, philosophy, psychology, and history. Campion also reveals commentary from noted Beatles authors, biographers, music historians, and journalists. And finally, a peek into the craft of songwriting from a host of talented composers across several generations. Take a Sad Song is a tribute to how a song can define, inspire, and affect us in ways we don't always fully comprehend, as well as a celebration of a truly amazing track in the Beatles canon that reveals one band's genius and underscores its lasting voice in our cultural and musical landscape. James Campion is a syndicated columnist and contributing editor for the pop culture magazine, the Aquarian Weekly, where he's reported on and interviewed several and varied musical artists and reviewed concerts and albums for 23 years. His long-form music essays are featured in the webzine Dog Door Cultural. His work has also appeared in New York Newsday, North County News, Hackwriters, Huff Post, among other periodicals. He's also the co-host of the popular music podcast Underwater Sunshine with Counting Crows frontman Adam Duritz. The two host an annual music festival in New York City by the same name. I put together a playlist of some of the most popular versions of Hey Jude, including, of course, the Beatles version. You can check it out over at the show notes page. Now, let's talk to James Campion. James Campion, welcome to the podcast.
Eric, it's great to be on. I'm a big fan.
Thank you so much, and I'm a big fan of this book. This is an outstanding book on an iconic song. But as we know, there are plenty of iconic songs from the Beatles. Why this specific song?
Well, a couple of reasons. I was inspired by some of my mentors, Greil Marcus, who wrote Like a Rolling Stone, Bob Dylan at the Crossroads, which actually also inspired my last book about Warren Zevon, Accidentally Like a Martyr, because I wrote a series of essays about songs to sort of depict the artist. And in this case, I was whittling it down to one song. Why Hey Jude? When I was a kid, and I've told this story a couple of times, but it's true. When I was a kid, about 5 or 6, I don't know where I would have heard it, but I used to sing the na-na part, the ending, the coda part, to help me fall asleep at night when I would have a nightmare or be scared or something like that. It was just kind of ingrained in my system. I've heard a lot of people talk about that over the years, that's the kind of song that just seems, that's the kind of melody that just seems to always exist. And I've always been fascinated by why songs work, how they work for us, lyrically, musically, keys, tempos, styles. And, who was better than the Beatles? They did all that stuff in the 60s. And Paul McCartney, one of the great melodicists and arguably one of the greatest songwriters of the 20th century. And Hey Jude just kept coming back. It kept coming back. And then in 2019, when I originally pitched it for my publisher, my dad got sick and he passed. And the last song I heard before he passed was Hey Jude. And I ended up dedicating this book to him. He passed in October of 2019. And then, of course, the pandemic hit in early 2020, and the whole world seemed to be saying, this is like 1968 again. This is crazy. And, Hey Jude came out in 68 during all the turmoil internationally and here in America, certainly. So all those things seemed to coalesce. They said there was a confluence of all these different universal hints. So why not? I took some time and wrote down a treatment, sent it to my publisher, and they were all disparate. They were gone because of the COVID and the quarantining. So I was very lucky. They stayed in touch with me, and I just wrote the book as a labor of love with no advance or anything. I just took the entire 9-10 months we were all stuck inside, and I lived in the head of Paul McCartney with the Beatles and with this wonderful, wonderful song that I ended up learning so much about that I felt it really did warrant an entire book.
There are some powerful quotes throughout the book that are fitting when talking about the song Hey Jude. One that leads into the book I love, and it's from Herman Melville, the American novelist, short story writer, and poet best known for his masterpiece from 1851, Moby Dick. And the quote is, "Genius all over the world stands hand in hand, and one shock of recognition runs the whole circle round." And I wondered if there is a story behind you choosing that specific quote.
Yes, I first heard Hunter Thompson mention that in an interview one time, and it always inspired me. I was always one of those young men and even middle-aged men that had difficulty with Moby Dick. I like Melville's short stories, but that's a tough one. And because just like Hey Jude, trying to figure out why it's a great song, you want to find out what makes a great novel. That always comes back to me because I always looked at Hey Jude or any great song. One of the things I've been telling a lot of people doing these interviews is that, if you don't love Hey Jude, there are songs you do love. And a lot of the same techniques, a lot of the same reasons why we love any song, is inside, I believe, in this book. It's songwriters, professors, music journalists, biographers, they all came to the table to tell me what it is that works for this song, that makes it a lasting classic. But it also works for other songs that you may find throughout your life that inspired you. So I feel like any song is that spark. And there is a sense of recognition around the world that we all are part of, we all are geniuses. I know that's an overused term, but we all are connected somehow to why we love music. And you don't need to be literate. You don't need to be a music nerd like myself, or you don't need to get involved with all these different, read all these books and everything. We know why we love music, and I think music, I'm not saying that that's what Melville was saying, but for me, it spoke loudly about what Hey Jude did in a very difficult year, as I said, in 1969, to spark the world and give it some positive hope. I called it comfort in unity. And I thought that was an apt quote for the beginning of the book. Thanks for noticing it. Appreciate that.
Music can be enjoyed by musicians, non-musicians, like you say, folks like us who are the music nerds. We love to read about everything, but there's a visceral reaction to music. And sometimes we don't even know why. It's subconscious in a way, because this book explores that, where I read through these chapters and, well, that's right. Now that's why I'm feeling that when I hear this.
Yeah, and, it's just like anything else. There are songs that are by, let's say, lesser stars or lesser lauded musicians or bands than the Beatles. But when I think of the Beatles, I truly do think of Mozart and Beethoven. And I think of this lasting idea musically that hits us on every level. So you could appreciate the Aeolian cadences, and you could appreciate the double plagal, use in the na-na part. But you could just love a good sing-along. And the Beatles did that. They worked on so many levels. I really truly believe that the Beatles were very much an experimental band that just happened to be a pop band that dominated and had number one AM hits, like this one, a 7-minute song. What? That the coda, which doesn't even have lyrics, is longer than the structured song. That's another classic example of why the Beatles are so unique. And so again, getting back to it, this is why I wrote the book. How do we figure out how these great geniuses make us all love the song, whether we care or know about music or not?
Yeah, well, I'm not sure if it's intentional on their part, but they know, at least for the Beatles, and we're talking about Paul and John, they knew how to tap into our emotions in a way that no other songwriting partnership canon. There's some great ones out there, but they knew how to tug on the heartstrings at just the right time, and even some in the most simplistic of ways or very complex.
Yeah, and their relationship, of course, which I delve into deeper, and I had not read it to the extent in which I dive deeper into it, is their childhoods, their connection as young men, 17, 15, I think, respectively, John and Paul, and what losing their mothers at a tender age did, and how they connected to that, and how their greatest love songs speak to that loss. And we all have that in us. We all have that love, that maternal love that we have. We all have that need to be cared for. We want to be loved. We want to let our lovers understand what we mean to them. And you're right. I mean, the Beatles did this. I argue, you got your great ones over the decades, certainly, but I think they did it as well as anyone.
Let's talk about that. Paul's childhood, you write about in the book, and it's evident that writing music was his escape. He lost his mom when he was just 14. He didn't even know she was sick until his father brought him to the hospital. Can you talk a little bit about Paul's childhood days and how, as you write, he discovered music as if a hidden gem?
Yeah, it's really, the more I delved into this song, and I named one of the chapters, I think, Man is Song, Song is Man, how much music means to Paul. His biographer, Howard Soon, said to me, when Paul goes for the music metaphor, like take a sad song and make it better, he's serious, because music is what he is about. I know it's easy for me to say that because Paul's been writing songs now for 65 years? And he's been, like I said, the most prolific songwriter in the 20th century and beyond. But he really did suffer that trauma. His mother, Mary, who he writes about in song, literally in Let It Be, but also he came to learn in his 40s that when I wrote yesterday, why she had to go, I don't know. She wouldn't say, was about his mom, as you said, that one day she was, working and loving them and cleaning their skinned knee, and a couple of months later, she was on her deathbed from breast cancer. Back then, there wasn't a lot of communication that way, especially with the children. This is the 1950s. Mary was also a nurse, so she never wanted the doctors or anyone to make a big fuss about her. She was a caregiver, not a caregetter. Paul got a lot of that from her. The empathy that Paul has, the songs that he writes, whether it's Lady Madonna or Your Mother Should Know or Let It Be or Hey Jude. All of these things, Paul has always put his feet in the shoes of women to make that expression. So she meant everything to him. And so when she dies, not coincidentally, he picks up the guitar. He hears Elvis. His dad picks up the piano again, something he loved. His dad was a musician. And starts playing it to get over this trauma, this grief. And he sees that. And of course, he has all these aunties and uncles coming over singing around the piano. How could he not? He embraces it. And then when he figures out at the very tender age of 15 and 16 to write his first songs, and his first song is I Lost My Little Girl, which, hits you right in the solar plexus when you realize that. He's reborn. And he continues the rest of his life to share that feeling of salvation, of comfort that he gets with song. And I believe, truly now, after spending a year of my life plus on this song, that Hey Jude is the culmination of what Paul was doing in song up to that point. And it may be his lasting statement of all the great songs, all the great Beatles songs and Paul McCartney songs, maybe a lasting statement about his feelings that about music and about what Linda meant to him, whom he just consummated his relationship with within weeks, days really, of writing Hey Jude. All those things are in there. And I think it all starts from his childhood, as much as it did, Eric, for John, because John's childhood was much tougher than Paul's. His parents did not stay together. His father left, whereas Paul had his dad. And his mother farmed him off to his Aunt Mimi. And the father didn't come back until he was famous. And his mother was more like his friend. And he finally reconnected with her, and she gets hit by an off-duty cop by a car and dies when he's 17. And he's just lost, crushed. And he said all the way up to the final interview he did, the Playboy interview, where he says, I was looking for her. It was psychological. I knew that I was infusing the death of my mother in these love songs. You know, when he writes Julia, a song of his mother's name is Julia, in 1968, just a couple of weeks before Paul pens Hey Jude, he calls it, he mentions the words Ocean Child. And Ocean Child is Yoko Ono. In Japanese is Ocean Child. And so he meets Yoko, again, within weeks of Paul meeting Linda, the two women that will complete them. Paul will be with Linda till she died at 58 years old in 1998. And of course, John's assassination in 1980. And they are finding these women together. So of course, when John hears Paul's song, You Have Found Her, Now Go and Get Her, he's like, hey, this song's about me, you know? And Paul's like, well, it's kind of about me too. And it's just so lovely. It's the story of the two of them and what they did for the world. They're incredible love songs. They're incredible songs of peace and joy, celebrating everything from She Loves You to I Want to Hold Your Hand, all the way through to beautiful songs like Julia and Let It Be. These guys just tapped into that, and it's a special, special place that they hit us. And you're right, they do hit us on a more emotional level, which is why I subtitled the book The Emotional Currency of Hey Jude, because it does pay forward over the decades.
What did they feel when Charles Manson interpreted that song the way he did? Helter Skelter, just about a silly little children's playground slide, and Manson interprets that in the most evil of ways. You know, I remember hearing audio from John Lennon talking about that. He's just like, it's just a song about a silly little playground ride. It's just that must have blown their minds.
I was always fascinated by the fact that I wrote 3 pieces back in 2019 about it for the Aquarian Weekly, about how the moon landing, the Manson murders, and Woodstock all happened with about 3 weeks of each other in the summer of '69. Very, very seminal moments, clearly, for the culture and also the world. But yeah, I mean, John always played with interviewers. I've heard him say that, and he used to make fun of people. I know he wrote songs like Glass Onion to make fun of, the crazy Beatle fans that interpreted his stuff. But come on, John's favorite line in Hey Jude is, the movement you need is on your shoulder. Paul just put it in there as a placeholder, and John's like, you're not taking that out. It's the best line in it. And that song means what? Everything and nothing. And so that's what great poetry does. That's what the spark of genius, the world round, that Melville, I believe, is talking about in that quote. And I think John understood that better than even Paul, because John played with words. His 2 books in his own right, and Spaniard's Works, or whatever those 2 books are, and all his limerick writing, his sort of imagery writing, and I Am the Walrus and Lucy in the Sky with Diamonds. John knew how to play with the language to infuse little, not specific messages to tell someone to go murder somebody. I'm not saying that. But for John to say, wow, I can't understand why anybody would misinterpret any of our songs, when they put fun things in the songs to kind of have, and even Paul says this, I think he told Mark Lewison this, but he's mentioned this in the past, about how they understood implicitly, and I try to draw that line in the book. They tried to interject personal messages out to the fans, because that's why you get a lot of you and me's in these titles, From Me to You, and all those, the please me, and I want to hold your hand. They knew, Paul said it, we were writing to communicate with our fans. So when they started to get a little vague, opaque, playful in their language, and John's the number one guy, that could lend to what I'm saying in Hey Jude, which is a very positive message of comfort and support, and then misinterpret it for evil. And you could do that with any art, as we know.
The Booked on Rock podcast will return after this. If you're a publisher or author of a book on rock and you want to be on the Booked on Rock podcast, contact us through our website, bookedonrock.com, or send an email to the bookedonrockpodcast@gmail.com. Hey Jude clocks in at 7 minutes, 11 seconds, the longest number 1 pop single of all time. But it wasn't intended to be that long. As Paul would later say, the now famous ending refrain was just too damn fun to stop. But before we get to the end of Hey Jude, even the beginning, let's get into how the song comes into existence. Eric Hutchinson is interviewed for the book. He says, Quote, "It's just one of those songs, it's hard to believe it didn't ever exist. It just feels like it's been around forever. I always assumed that's how Paul McCartney felt when he wrote it, like it just fell out of him and the melody wrote itself." Can you take us back to the moment when this song entered Paul's mind?
Well, again, I'm sticking to it. I think that Paul was always meant to write this song. I think a lot of his songs were in him, and he carried them throughout his life. And when he talks about this a lot, and I mention it in the How the Song Works chapter, he uses the word magic a lot. He wrote the song on what he called this magic piano that he had painted because it has certain tonal quality of it. He wrote all of his great piano ballads on there in the 60s. He talks about the magic of the Beatles. He talks about the magic first one take of Hey Jude. Not many people know that. They did 4 takes of it, and the first take is the one you hear.
Insane. On
the record. Insane. He talks about all the magic. It comes up all the time. But he's a craftsman. He's a pro. He knows what I mentioned Mozart and Beethoven, or I mentioned Chuck Berry or Bob Dylan or Brian Wilson or Prince or Michael Jackson. It doesn't matter. Like, they're all magicians in their own way because they tap in, like you said earlier, to our emotions with music and with lyric. But the way the story goes, Paul being Paul again, John meets Yoko as Paul meets Linda. Now, Paul is engaged to Jane Asher, the actress. They've had a very volatile up and down relationship, but he's been living with her family for the last couple of years, and they're engaged. But Paul is falling in love with Linda. He meets her in 1967 at the Sgt. Pepper's party, and then he meets her again at a club, and then he meets her then again in earlier 68 when John and Paul go to New York to promote Apple Records, which Hey Jude is the first single for Apple Records, owned by the Beatles. So and then he goes back to the Capitol Records convention by himself, and I think by design, to be with Linda, and they fall deeply in love. And when he comes back, he's a changed man. This is June of 1968. Again, simultaneously, John had met Yoko in late 66 at the Indica Gallery, which, by the way, Paul McCartney started and bankrolled. So think about that. John meets Yoko at the Indica Gallery in London, and John goes on a whim to go see Yoko Ono's art, and he's intrigued by her. She sends him letters when they're away at the Maharishi. They stick together, they hang out together as friends, colleagues, artists. And then a couple of weeks before Paul writes Hey Jude, John consummates his relationship with Yoko. And this is all in the swirl, right? So Paul comes back from this trip in June to Capitol Records, and they're recording the White Album at this time. And John's bringing Yoko around. And Paul can see it. And nobody's talking to Cynthia. John's married. Cynthia Lennon and their son Julian. So Paul, being his mom, that empathetic character. Who does this? I think Rob Sheffield from Rolling Stone, I interviewed him in the book. He was great. He's like, what rock star at 26 is going off to visit his buddy's ex-wife and kid? And of course, Paul loved kids. One of the reasons why he and Jane Asher didn't work ultimately, and him and Linda did and had lots of kids together, is that he really loved kids. He loved his father's stepdaughter. Father remarried years later after Mary passed. He loved Linda's daughter from her first marriage. And he and Julian got along. Julian says, I only remember playing with Paul as a kid, not Dad. I only remember gifts. I only remember playing. And there are great photographs of this. There's a wonderful photograph I include in the book of Paul holding Julian as a kid, with John kind of faded, kind of out of focus in the background, which I think is sort of metaphoric. But so Paul gets in his Aston Martin and he drives out to Kenwood Estate, where John's been living now for the last couple of years since the Beatles became famous. And he goes to visit and comfort Julian and Cynthia. He's known Cynthia since he met John, since they were teenagers. And he remembers John getting, Cynthia getting pregnant with John's kid, who becomes Julian, and that's why they have to get married. So it was kind of a marriage of convenience, or because they felt they were doing the right things. Not that John didn't love Cynthia, but you know what I'm saying. They were children, and they had to get married. So, John becomes famous. He starts to grow out of that and meets Yoko. But Paul never forgets these people, and he goes back there. And you know what the coolest thing about this is, Eric, is that Paul had been driving out to Kenwood for years. And every time he'd go out there, he'd have a melody in his head, or he'd go to show John something, or John would want him to finish something. So Drive My Car and, Lucy in the Sky with Diamonds. And, there's like a dozen songs the two of those guys wrote 8 days a week, while he was living out there. So here's Paul. He's on his way up there, and he's thinking about song, because that's what he did when he drove that same drive. And he starts singing to himself, "Hey, Jules, don't make it bad. Take a sad song and make it better." And he tells his biographers, "Hey, I just wanted him to feel okay, because I know what it's like to lose a mom." And John knew what it was like to lose his dad at the same age as John is leaving his family for Yoko. I mean, this is all intertwined, and it's in there. It's in this song. It's really miraculous, quite frankly.
The decision to change it from Hey Jules to Hey Jude, was it simply, as Paul later said, because it was easier to sing? Because I thought maybe John was like, "Hey man, back off. Don't sing about," because he had a strained relationship with Julian. So it's like, I always wondered if it was that, or is it just simply, it's easier to sing?
Yeah, and I also must note that John had written a song. The last song on the White Album is called "Good Night." It's a lullaby, literal lullaby. And John was so moved he wrote it for his son because he felt terrible about what was happening. Because John wasn't completely cold. He was going through turmoil himself, but he couldn't even sing it. Just a couple of days before they had a break, and Paul drove up to do this. So, Paul is saying what he did before. John would say to Paul, "How could you play with Julian? I don't know how you could do that. I can't do that." But of course, John had did not have a loving family. It did not, at least Paul had his mom for a couple of years, and she was there all the time. And to everything that Paul and his brother Michael say, very loving woman. Again, a nurse, a caregiver. And again, John's mother was a lot of fun, but she was like a party girl. And, one of the reasons why his father left is because, she was pregnant with another man's child. So he leaves, and so he has no father figure. He has a mother figure who's more like a sister. His Aunt Mimi's sort of buttoned down. So what does John know about familial love? What does he know about affection? Years later, Paul tells a story where John runs up to him in like 1974, after the Beatles broke up and they were estranged. And I put it in the book. And he runs up and he hugs Paul. And he whispers in his ear, "Hugging is good. Hugging's good." And Paul was like freaked out by this. But he said over the years, he understood exactly what John meant. John couldn't do it, so Paul did it in a weird way for him. The way they supported each other in song and in the band and as kids and as adults, they were always there for each other. There was a great love, and I believe that's also in Hey Jude. Because he sings, "You will find someone to perform with." He uses that line. A lot of people gloss over that line. It's like a weird line to say. You'll find someone to perform with. What? Perform sexually? Perform what? No. And think about it. Not only is he talking about his relationship with John here, as well as the breakups that he and John are going through with Jane and with Cynthia, but he's talking about what he and John are going to do. What are they going to do? John is going to do art live in front of the world with Yoko from the moment they're together until they make Double Fantasy months before he's assassinated. And Paul puts Linda in his band. Who puts your wife in the band? No, you think Mick Jagger was going to do that? You think Eric Clapton was going to do that? You think, just go down the list. No one's doing that. Paul did. John did. And so, that's in the song itself too. And again, I just keep coming back to it. The more you dive into a song with this kind of depth, the more you're going to get out of it. And I hope that a lot of you mentioned the commentary, Eric Hutchinson, singer-songwriter, and I have professors of philosophy and sociology and musicology, certainly, and history, and they all chime in. I think they all lend a different voice. I think you'll get something out of someone else's angle on the song.
So having said that, then I don't think, John didn't have any issues. It wasn't like he went to Paul and said, "Change it. I don't want it, Jules." That never happened.
No, John thought the song was about him and Yoko.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, you have found her, now go and get her. And John's like, "Oh my goodness," and he told many interviewers about that. But no, he changed it because he claims he changed it because of the name Judd from Oklahoma. Paul says
the Broadway musical,
but Jude just makes more sense. Again, Paul's the ultimate craftsman, really is.
But now, okay, so is there a religious connection here with the Jude name? Or is it just simply named after the character in Oklahoma?
Well, I have some fun with this, Eric, as you know, in the book. So you decide. Jude is, of course, of the 12 tribes of Israel, Judah, Jude. In fact, when Paul playfully painted Hey Jude on one of the places that the Beatles owned, the boutique in London, he got some backlash from the Jewish Defamation League because they remember only 20 years before in Germany, Juden painted on the windows. And so there's Jude, right? Just the name Jude. But of course there's Saint Jude, which I write about in the book, which I found so great. These things popped up as I was doing the research. I grew up as a Catholic, so Saint Jude is considered the patron saint of lost causes. Paul's writing a song to comfort Julian. He's writing a song because his band has plateaued in the world of music. They're still big, the Beatles, but they're not the way they were in 67 or before. Their manager dies. They have the blow up with the Maharishi. John's going his way. George has got, spirituality. Ringo's doing movies. They're not that four-headed monster that Mick Jagger called them anymore. They're going in different directions. The White Album is sort of disparate. Paul's falling in love with Linda. John's falling in love with Yoko. All these things are happening, and he's saying, are the Beatles a lost cause? In 1968, in America, the assassination of Martin Luther King, the assassination of Robert Kennedy, the riots in the Democratic Convention, the riots in the streets in Columbia University, Vietnam, hundreds and hundreds of kids coming home every day dead in 68, the bloodiest year of the war. In Europe, there's riots in France. They had to shut France down, and Charles de Gaulle left the country, and they just shut everything down. Like we complained in 2020, and, it was pretty bad. This was 50 times worse. They had no economy in France. The streets were completely anarchy. You had what was going on in Ireland and England. Russia invades Czechoslovakia. I mean, it's just the world is on fire. And so Jude, the patron saint of lost causes, come on, that's pretty cool. Yeah.
So many lyrics that stand out in this song, obviously, but your friend Adam Duritz of Counting Crows says, Hey Jude is a perfectly crafted song, and lyrically, it begins with a simple message. Take a sad song and make it better. Paul's biographer, Peter Ames Carlin, talked about this message. Can you talk about his thoughts on the importance of that line in terms of understanding Paul as an artist, that take a sad song and make it better line?
Yeah, like Howard Soon said, one of his biographers that I interviewed for the book, I mean, when Paul goes to music as a metaphor, he's serious. He's through screwing around. He's not being playful. He's going right, that sad song. And as he sings it, too, take a sad song, it's the high note there. And it just breaks my heart every time. And he's saying that was the line that he had. Hey, Jules, don't make it bad. Take a sad song, which I love that in a rhyme, too, and make it better. So it's nothing more than that. It's a pep talk. It's a please don't give up. And I also love the idea that Paul is saying you could take a sad song. You can make it better. You have found her. Now go and get her. It's a song about action. It's a song about inner change as opposed to, say, John's All You Need Is Love, or Imagine, some of these, or Give Peace a Chance, these grandiose statements. Paul is getting under the skin. He literally writes, let her under your skin. I think it was Dr. Oxier from, I always want to get these people's names right, Dr. Randall Oxier from Southern Illinois University, because they did so many things for me in this book and added so much to it. He says, when you think of under my skin, except for the Sinatra song, you think of, itchy, oh God, she's getting under that. This person's getting under my skin. But Paul's saying, get under the skin. And what Adam Duritz said so beautifully in the book is, you have to be vulnerable to find love. And the Beatles put up armor to become famous. They were so famous, they had to stop touring and making appearances. They became this thing. They stopped becoming people. And so, Paul is saying, let it out and let it in. I think it was Kylie Lotz, who goes by Petal, another great young singer-songwriter from Philadelphia, and gave me the female perspective of this. She's like, what is that really? It's breathing. Let it out. Let it in. Give and get. I mean, it's all in there. So it starts off with this beautiful sentiment, and then it builds on that until the wonderful coda, where he brings everybody in, and now we're together. That's why I call the first part of the song Comfort, and the second part Unity. The na-na part is the unity part. And remember, too, Eric, for fans of music, the Beatles were great at this. They loved the first lines, and in some cases, the first thing you hear, help, I need somebody, she loves you, yeah, yeah, yeah. The first lines is the name of the song. So when you ask somebody, how does Hey Jude go? What do you say? Hey Jude, da, 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 da. You don't do the other parts. I mean, that's the weird thing about the song. It doesn't even really have a chorus. The chorus is the coda. So it's also a very strangely arranged song. But yeah, I mean, it's simply take a sad song and make it better. And that's why I named it Take a Sad Song, because again, take this thing. You have the physical ability. And I also want to quote something from the book that I haven't been able to do, and I really would like to do it for you and your audience. And again, I hope people do read it because we go into it deeply. So it was Dr. William Boone who brought it up to me, but there's this book called African American Studies, Black Pentecostal Breath by the author Ashton Crawley. And he writes this as the title of the essay in it is The Aesthetics of Possibility. And he writes, we turn to art because it enacts the world that we want to live in. That's what Paul is saying with this song. You could make this happen, but it starts with you. It starts with one footstep, one acceptance of something. And then when he says, let her under your skin, or you have found her, go and get her. Don't let this go. You have a chance now. Don't be cool. He actually says, don't be that cool guy. Don't put that armor on. Get rid of the armor. You have a chance to get hurt. John later sings, don't let me down, with such pain and anguish. That's a gorgeous song. And just like John sings the high harmony with Paul on this one, Paul goes on the high harmony, so they're supporting each other. Two songs about, hey, you have to be vulnerable, otherwise you're not going to be able to be loved. I think that's what the core message. I say it over and over again. The song's about the 60s, the song's about Julian, the song's about the Beatles, the song's about John and Paul, but you know what? And Linda and Yoko. But it at its core, it is a love song. And maybe not so much a love song for an outer love, but learn to love yourself, and then you can find that happiness.
There was a great interview I did with a guy by the name of Mike Errico. He wrote a book, Music, Lyrics, and Life, a field guide for the advancing songwriter, and can't recall which episode it is, but I urge people to go back and listen to that if you haven't. He talked about the importance of the opening lyrics, how important that is. And I thought about that when you're talking about that opening line and how important that is for most, if not all, Beatles songs, that opening line.
Right. And again, getting back to Moby Dick, I am Ishmael. Or, it was the best of times, it was the worst of times. These are there's a reason why you pull, we know this as writers, you pull the reader in, and then you have to keep the reader. And the fact that Hey Jude has that wonderful beginning, and then it just blasted out at the end, is a real testament to the genius of great songwriting, but also great production by George Martin. That never gets boring, that na-na part. 19 times they sing that for 4 minutes plus, and different instruments come in. Listen to that. That's the other thing I love about writing a book like this. I tell everybody, go back to your favorite songs. I know you've heard these songs a billion times, but you may catch something in the artistry the billionth and one time that you listen to it.
It's so true. Or go back and listen to a song that you thought you were burned out on. Give it a year or two, maybe 5, maybe even 10 years. Go back to it. As you get older, you start listening for different things, picking up, connecting on different things. That's the beauty of music.
It is. And the last, doing that my podcast with Adam, Underwater Sunshine, one of the things we talk about is that neither one of us has any kind of cold shoulder for any kind of music. We love all styles of music. And over the last 10 years, I've really reconnected, and I can't even say reconnected. I've connected with a lot of disco, a lot of dance music from the 70s that was just, you wanted to just seriously bang your head against the wall. Some of these songs were great when they first came out, and I didn't just say, oh, disco sucks, I don't like disco, I like rock music. Not at all. But after a while, it became a little rote, it became a little thin, a little fey. But I tell you, there is true artistry in the way they crafted those songs too. And now as I get older and I look back at those songs and I don't have them ringing in my ear forever, I could really listen to them with fresh ears. And I think that's the way the Beatles are too. Rob Sheffield said the Beatles didn't happen. The Beatles are happening all the time. And I really do feel that way with different generations rediscovering these songs that we think we knew, but maybe we didn't.
James Campion, author of Take a Sad Song, The Emotional Currency of Hey Jude. this empathy that Paul felt for Julian. Some interesting comments you received regarding this. Author and professor of music theory at the University of Michigan, Walter Everett. All these guys that contribute, these professors, what a great insight they have. He says, quote, "It is an interesting angle to cite Paul's empathy because he's not known for his empathy in the studio or in his personal relations. It's in the music that it appears more readily." Author and essayist Devin McKinney talked about how we know of Paul's empathy filtered through his music, and he feels those feelings are real. It's not just for effect in a song. I never gave much thought about this until I read your book. I agree with Devin. I always felt it was sincere. I think you do as well, but do you believe that Paul's empathy through his music is sincere?
I do. I don't think Professor Everett Walter has written some great books. He co-wrote with another Beatle scholar, Tim Riley, What Goes On, which is, I highly recommend it. And Tim was a wonderful friend and a great supporter of the book and gave me hours of his time. He's excellent. His quotes are fantastic. He also wrote a beautiful book in the 1980s called Tell Me Why. He was the first writer, to my knowledge, that wrote every song breakdown of the Beatles. So please check those books out. I think what Walter's saying there is that it's hard to connect those two because Paul could be very petty and very controlling. And you see that in the Get Back footage that just came out, and also the original Let It Be with him fighting with George and sort of leading everyone. But remember, too, the band was breaking off. You know, John was not fully engaged all the time, and George wasn't either. And to George's defense, he was kind of being squeezed out a little bit by John and Paul. And Ringo just wanted to play, so he wasn't going to get involved in this. So Paul kind of took that mantle, but he could be a little more abrasive and not as empathetic towards people's feelings because it's art. A perfect example is George Harrison wanted to play a lick after every line in the song, and Paul endured it for as long as he could, and he was like, "I'm sorry, George, this is not working." And George said, "Fine, put the guitar down." And unlike in the next sessions in '69, he sort of was laughing about it, enjoying it, and then later on played like sort of this bass kind of guitar on it. So even in the making of Hey Jude, there is some little bit of riff of Paul being that way. And of course, Walter is referencing the fact that Paul, like every rock star, was a womanizer. He's Paul McCartney. He's the cute one. He's hugely popular. He stayed single longer than the other three guys. And, you know, he had his dalliances, and he could be cold and calculating when it came to that. So I think Walter's saying we have to be careful to say that the art, conflating the art with the artist, or to separate it. But I agree with Mr. McKinney in the sense, and with you, Eric, that I don't think somebody's actions are necessarily always what they appear to be. I talk about a lot of the things that Paul does do, like his empathy for Brian Jones, who was going through, from the Rolling Stones, who was going through terrible drug busts and recoveries. He eventually will die in June of '69 after the Stones kicked him out. And he kept visiting him, had him over his house. Robert Frazier, the famous, art, maestro and connoisseur, he got sick with AIDS in the '80s in Linden. He would visit him all the time. Paul answered all his fan mail. He would let people into his apartment. He would hang out with the girls that hung out in front of his house and in front of Apple Studios. So there is those other examples where Paul is kind of channeling Mary, his mom, I think. But, you know, he's a young man. And young men will do what young men do, and famous young men will do. So I think there is a balance there. But I tend to lean more that I think that the music, if you listen to Paul's music more than anybody else's from the period, it really does infuse more empathy. And I think, aside from maybe Brian Wilson, who adored Paul, adored him, and was influenced by him, as Paul was influenced by Brian. But if you look at the other contemporaries, like the Stones or Bob Dylan, maybe Pete Townsend to a certain extent with The Who, but that was a little later on. So I think Paul really stands head and shoulders above that. His art and his life seem to be more empathetic, I think.
Peter Ames Carlin surmised that Paul was at his best operating on a subconscious level. He says to have written Hey Jude makes perfect sense. What did he mean by that?
Because I believe that Paul was letting go of some things with Hey Jude. I really do. Again, you cannot separate the times Dr. Koch from NC State University, musicologist, says he teaches his class about Beethoven. He doesn't separate Ludwig van Beethoven from his times in Vienna. You have to look into that and understand where we're at. Again, 68 is chaos for the youth movement that the Beatles kind of built. That was a huge, lifting of boats there. They're coming apart. The left is breaking. The right is breaking. The college campuses. You've got the Black Panthers and the Martin Luther King side of the civil rights movement. You've got the Weather Underground later on breaking off from the youth movements. There's constant clashing, and then of course the Beatles again breaking apart and all those things. So Paul is trying to let go, I think, subconsciously in this song, and stop. Try not to be as controlling and let himself be vulnerable. I do think that Paul is better in his subconscious. I think when he wrote some of his better songs, when he and Jane Asher were having some fights like We Can Work It Out or For No One, Tomorrow Never Knows, these songs really do go deeper. And then later on, The Long and Winding Road. Here's a 27, 28-year-old man, just like the 21-year-old Joni Mitchell writing both sides now. What does she get off writing a song that a 70-year-old woman should be singing? And when Joni sang it at 70, you were like, oh my God, you got lightheaded because you thought, she's actually lived these things now. Paul wrote When I'm 64 when he was like 15 or 16 years old. So how does he, what?
Yeah, well, that lends to the theory. Some people say we were here before.
Okay, fine. Then he's tapping into that subconscious. That's good. I'll go with that. It's art, Eric. So that's the beauty of writing about it. I think it was, I always misquote this, but I don't even say it right, but I think people get the point. I think it was Elvis Costello that said that writing about music is like dancing to architecture. What are we really doing here?
That's a great line. The Booked on Rock podcast will return after this. Like the Booked on Rock podcast? Tell a friend and give us a 5-star review wherever you listen to your favorite podcasts. Let's go back to Don't Carry the World Upon Your Shoulders. Adam Duritz, He's got a great read on that line. The song is saying you don't have to take the world on. Everything you need is already there.
Yeah, and also later on, as Adam pointed out smartly, in the very same song, talk about dichotomy, he says, hey, Jude, you'll do. You got this. You got this. Hey, Jude, you'll do. I think it was Professor Auxilier said to me when I was a kid, I thought he said, hey, Jude, you too. As opposed to, he thinks that and that made him think that there's other people in the room, which he loved that interpretation. And of course, he's a psychology, he's a philosophy professor. So it makes a lot of sense he would go there. The key line to the song, everybody goes back to, even Paul, who says he can't help but think of John when he sings it now, even today, is the movement you need is on your shoulder. And that's what Adam's talking about. And we break that down in the book 3 times. The use of it originally by Paul. And then, of course, the movements that are going on in 1968 that I touched upon a few minutes ago. And then, of course, it means everything and it means nothing again. I think all the interpretations are apt. It could be pushing your shoulder forward. It could be the thing that you have, it's in you yourself, like, hey, Jude, you'll do. But again, earlier in the song, he says, you got to take that weight off your shoulders. The last Beatles song that's ever done, if you take out Her Majesty on Abbey Road, is Carry That Weight. Paul's going back to that again and saying, you got to take this stuff on, but maybe sometimes you just got to let it go and let other people, you don't carry the world on your shoulders. You don't have to do that. And a lot of people touched upon mental health in this book. And a lot of people talked about, a lot of the songwriters talked about these very, very powerful but subtle messages, not hammering you over the head. Eric Hutchinson said he's talking in the second person, hey, Jude. So he could be very preachy, but he's not. He's being comforting. It's a hand on a shoulder, I think. Katie Darby Mullins, my friend and a professor of writing, she says it is a hand on your shoulder, and it's so he's not being preachy, he's being comforting, and they're all in there, And I'm so glad that you're quoting some of the people here in this interview because it's so hard for me to remember. There's so many great insights in this book.
Hey, that's what I'm here for, to remind you of what's in the book.
Yes, I need to read this book.
Now, I'm gonna throw in a religious angle here. Now, could this be your cross to bear?
Right. Now, one thing that was pointed out to me by several of the people I interviewed for the book, that Paul McCartney in 1950, when he was a kid, what was he, 8 in 50, he was in the Liverpool Angelical Choir. So for Paul to not understand the importance or the pertinence of Jude in the Christian religion, maybe he was, he had Catholicism in his past, but there wasn't a lot of religion in the McCartney home. But there are some spiritual connections in this song, and certainly I believe in the na-nas, which I talk about as a pure gospel phrasing. As you know, it's called the double plagal cadence, structured 3 chords that Paul plays during the na 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 na, and when they go off for 4 minutes and he's screaming, he's tapping into that gospel. They call it a vamp, and he's into that, and that's part of, I believe, the spiritual, if not religious, underpinnings of the song itself.
What about the classical influence? You can trace music right up to this day, back as far as the classical period. And here we have Professor Koch says a Bach influence, a classic structure with a descending bass line when talking about the melody in the bridge. Was Paul a fan of classical music?
He was. In fact, Paul would often say that, when people asked him, especially in the mid-'60s, he brought up Brahms and Bach more than he brought up Chuck Berry and Elvis Presley, even though those guys were heavily, obviously, influenced by those guys. And those are the guys who woke them out of their mid-50s stupor when they were kids and made them want to be rock stars and songwriters and be in a band. But, yeah, I mean, look, I think that all of those influences are in there for Paul. Classical, gospel, rock and roll, country, western, which he writes a lot of those kind of songs at that time for the White Album. I mentioned in the book, the band had just shook the world by taking everything out of the psychedelia and bringing it back to Sawgerties with their first album, Bob Dylan's album at the end of '67, which was a very heavily religious album, John Wesley Harding. So that was always there for Paul. And Paul was very much into the avant-garde too. Everybody always says it was John and Yoko, but Paul was into like I said, with the Indigo Gallery and all of those things that he was out in London absorbing. And a lot of it was classical music. And yes, you hear classical music in a lot of whether they knew it or not, a lot of their Beatles songs. And as Dr. Koch says, that descending line that you get in a lot of those Beatles songs, whether it's Dear Prudence or A Day in the Life or Lucy in the Sky with Diamonds, For No One I mentioned earlier, boom, 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 boom. Yeah, they were really into that stuff. And that's in Hey Jude.
What about the one, Anytime You Feel the Pain? The connection to the 1960 Drifter song is there, right? Save the Last Dance for Me?
Yes. And all of this, again, is the subconscious. That's why Paul's great at the subconscious. The Beatles did nick different styles. Everybody did. Dylan, everybody was nicking the Stones. But I think here again, Paul is drawing in this because, God, they just love the doo-wop stuff. They just love that 60s pop music, that wonderful street American music that they ended up bringing back to America and reminding us how good that music was, because it kind of went out of favor a little bit there in 1961, 62, 63. And yeah, Professor Walter Everett brought it up. He said that we're supposed to hear the echo of this. It's supposed to remind us of these things. I think even when Paul says, yeah, and that one part before he goes back in again, he does the na-nas, na-na-na-na, na-na-na-na, Hey Jude, then he goes back. When that last time and he goes, yeah, and then he goes back into the piano part, I think he's running a straight line to She Loves You, yeah, yeah, yeah. And I think more than one person, and Tim Riley nailed it for me, but more than one person mentioned they see that lineage, they see that thread. In She Loves You, you have a younger man telling another man, hey, she loves you, you got to go get this. She's there, she loves you, you're blowing it. Same thing. You have found her. Now go and don't take this don't be cool. Don't take a bad song. I know you're in a bad way, but you got to look past that. And you got to see that this woman is here and she loves you. Again, go back to their past, John and Paul, trying to find their way back to their lost mother, to that lost love, that adoration, that tenderness, that affection. It's in all those Beatles songs, for sure.
And these songs become individual to these artists, mostly, I think, because of the voice. And you talk about Paul's voice in this, and there's the concept of modulation and how it adds context and interest. It takes the listener on a journey. This is specifically regarding the bridge to Hey Jude, taking a journey from a home key to a foreign key, and eventually the song takes you back home. Kylie Lotz talks about making the listener hang in long enough to where there's an even bigger payoff as a result, which is so cool.
Yes, and the payoff, is said by several, especially songwriters in the book. They, every singer-songwriter, payoff, it leads to the payoff. There's going to be this big payoff. And he hints and he teases at it, like I said, with the na-nas in the bridge. And there's a discussion among musicologists of whether Paul does change key there, or whether he's just modulating or shifting there, which is done in a lot of blues songs, country songs. Paul had a specific structure that he worked in. This is a little deviant of that, but he stayed in that structure for the song, and a lot of his ballads, like Maybe I'm Amazed and Let It Be and things like that. But he is using both the music and the lyrics to take us on this journey. We're not sure where he's going to go, but when the nanas come in, we're so happy to be there. It's like this great big hug. It's a great big musical hug. Like, Jude, and John, and Yoko, and Paul, and Linda, and all those kids in 1968, and all the people that sing this song together. In 1989, when I went to see Paul for the Flowers in the Dirt tour, the whole show was mind-boggling. You're in a room with the Beatles. You're in Madison Square Garden, and it's, classic for so many reasons. And here's Paul, and all the songs were great. I loved hearing Fool on the Hill and Sgt. Pepper's, and, he played a lot of Beatles songs. But when he played Hey Jude, you could feel 28,000 people became 10 people. It was just, I had never seen, and I've seen hundreds of concerts. I've never seen a sing-along like that, ever. That stuck with me too, by the way, Eric. And I bring it up in the introduction to the book. That stuck with me too. That's your emotional currency there. Think about it. Look around. All these people are singing this. They're just having a blast. And then when Paul put out Trip the Live Fantastic, the live record from that tour in 1990, listen to the version on that. He says, "Oh, take me back." And then later on he screams, "I can't stop this thing. Can you feel it? I can feel it." Hear him say that. I actually titled the last chapter, "Can you feel it? I can feel it," from what Paul says on that live record, because he's kind of saying, this is beyond me now. That's the magic he's talking. He's like, this thing has just gone off the rails.
The conflict resolve approach. Now, this is not one the Beatles invented, but man, do they make it so effective. This is a particular progression, and you talked to professor of music theory at Indiana University, Frank Samarato, who talked to you about how it's essentially two separate songs, but yet neither could have worked separately. So you have the beginning, and then you have that end, the na, 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 na part. Separately, they don't work at all, but together, it's perfect.
Yeah, so I came to Frank when I discovered his paper, and it was a intellectual treatise that he had written for his university called The Trope of Expectancy, Infinity in the Music of the Beatles and Others. And he talks about two different things, as you mentioned, the traditional ballad and the infinity part, which is the nanas. Neither one really works on their own. Hey Jude, the ballad part, it's great. Don't get me wrong. But I think the fact that he does take us on this journey, as we talked about earlier, and then we get to the nanas, really makes it. And of course, the double plagal cadence is called the amen cadence. We talked about it earlier, the gospel aspect, the amen. But the double one, he's using it. So subconsciously, people are hearing that. Even if you weren't raised in, say, a Christian family or with gospel music or with liturgical music, in which there are other aspects of that I hit upon in the book that was introduced to me by some of these professors. But Paul is tapping into that again subconsciously, and we hear it. We don't know where it came from, but I think it was Professor Halpern, the psychology professor that I interviewed for the book, who said that all music is us imagining and then finding out how these things happen. And we know about this in the womb. We've known about it since, humans were, carving things on cave walls. There's something very visceral and natural about it. And Paul does tap in with the na-na part. The words are not words. They're universal. Doesn't matter what country you come from. As I talk about in the introduction, he's singing it at the Kremlin. He's singing it at the Wembley Stadium. He's singing it at the White House. No matter where he goes, it doesn't matter. Brazil, he doesn't matter. They're singing it along with him because he makes it universal. He takes out the language barrier and makes it just almost like a mantra. I think Rob Sheffield called it a drone. And so very much it does hit all those bells, and it needs to be part of the first part. It also speaks to, and this is me just being junior psychologist, but I had some fun with it. He's kind of talking about how the youth movement has fractured. By 68, it has. It was all for one for all in 62, 63, 64, 65. It starts to fracture there. You could see it. Paul sees it in his town. He's out there every day in London, talking to the kids and seeing what's going on. And so he takes these two disparate parts, these two divergent parts, and he melds them together beautifully musically and in a song of hope and comfort. And by the way, it speaks to us today because everybody I talked to during the pandemic and everything we went through, politics and everything in the last 8-10 years, everything's so polarized. Everything is just, I don't think we can agree that kittens are cute anymore.
Yeah.
This is what happened. And so now, how much does a song mean again? It's universal. I had to get this in. Dr. Brune said, he tells his classes, all the great songs do these three things. They reflect the culture, they are the culture, and they shape the culture. And I think, and he thinks, Hey Jude does that, and still does that today.
And as Paul said, he was having too much fun to stop with that refrain. Did George Martin say, hey, this is going to be too long, we got to cut this down? What was the vibe in the studio regarding that? What did Paul have to say before we talk about George Martin? Why did he keep going with it? I mean, he says he was having a lot of fun with it.
Well, we talked about in the first place, there are available cuts on YouTube and other things. There was a White Album box set that came out a couple of years ago in 2018 on the anniversary of it. There are several versions. You could see the Beatles working it out, and each time they do, they sing the na-nas longer. They're singing it longer because they're trying to get the groove. A few of the musicologists pointed out that you could hear the band. Listen to that na-na part. You could hear the band stop being choppy. They get rid of the allegro, and they get more into the flow. You could hear the acoustic. Ringo, as Rob Sheffield said, this is such a Ringo song, man. He's on that ride cymbal. He is ruling beautifully. They become a band. They become a cohesive unit. Again, here's Paul, through his song Hey Jude, reconnecting this band that he's been with since a teenager, right? And they are going. So each time they go through it, they're figuring it out. They're figuring things they want to do, and they just love it. They're having a ball, really. And because, as we said earlier, they recorded the very first take at Trident Studios, is the take you hear on the record today. They just kept going. And they're figuring, now, you have to remember, when people record fade-out songs, they could play the song for 6 minutes, and then they just fade it out at 3.5 or 4.5 minutes. In fact, just a couple of weeks earlier, the Beatles were recording Revolution, and there's a version of Revolution that goes on for 11 minutes. And John's just screaming like Paul, and it becomes this mantra, and they're going over, it's all right, which ironically is the B-side of Hey Jude. So the Beatles were already doing that. They were vamping that way. And so they ran the tape until it was dead, and they just loved it. So they said, you know what? Let's keep going. Let's let it keep going. And when George Martin said, well, they're never going to play this on the radio, and John said, which I think is adorable, and Tim Riley, who wrote a great biography of John Lennon, said, John was an ego madman about his own music, and he and Paul were already clashing, but for John to stand up for Paul's number like this, a song that John adored until his death, said it was, Paul's greatest song. He said, he stood up in the studio and he was like, they'll play it if it's us. We're the Beatles. Give it to them the way it is. And, it became another niche thing. Someone recently asked me, do you think if it wasn't 7 minutes and 11 seconds, it would have been as popular? Of course. Do I think if they sang 16 nanas, around instead of 19, if it was 6 minutes and 50 seconds instead of 7 and 11? But it did have that cool little niche of the longest running number one song of all time.
I'm going to make a playlist, put it in the show notes page of all the really cool cover versions of the song. Is there any cover version of this song that stands out to you?
Oh, I've been playing. I have a Facebook page for the book. I hope that everybody goes to visit it. We're going to put lots of content on there. Every Friday I do Hey Jude Cover Friday. And I've put quite a few by unknown artists, by choirs, by young teenage singers. There's a Imaginary Future who I interviewed, Jesse, the lead singer in the book. He has a very gorgeous, intimate version of it. There's a wonderful version by a German band where they infuse different parts of it and then come back to the original melody part, so they don't end with the nas. They come back to the Hey Jude part. The most famous one, of course, is the one by Wilson Pickett that Duane Allman from the Allman Brothers and the Muscle Shoals Band plays on. In fact, a lot of people feel that version, I don't, but I think it's a great version, is superior. And many musicologists point to that version of Hey Jude, which only came out in, I think, early 69. So Hey Jude was only out a couple of months. And they point to that as the origin of Southern rock because of Duane Allman's appearance on there.
But Duane was uncredited on that.
He is uncredited, but he's absolutely playing. He was part of the Muscle Shoals studio band at the time, where he met a lot of the cats that would start the Allman Brothers. Muscle Shoals' famous, studio in Mobile, Alabama, or Muscle Shoals, Alabama, and where Muddy Waters recorded many great tracks. The Stones ended up playing there as well. And then a lot of the Stax and Atlantic stuff was recorded there. So those guys knew their business. And of course, Wilson Pickett is a vocalist genius and a musical genius. So that's a fantastic version. I know Elvis did a cover of it.
Ella Fitzgerald. Ella Fitzgerald did.
Yeah,
Roberta Flack,
yeah.
Temptations, Tom Jones. I'm just running down the list here. Diana Ross. Maynard Ferguson did a cover of it too.
Yes, that's right. There's a lot of instrumentals. And also, if I may, Eric, I put, and I'll lend it to you, I was going to put this list, but the book was long. I had to cut quite a few chunks out of the book to kind of streamline it and keep focused on the song. So many things I wanted to go, so many rabbit holes. If you're listening to this interview, you know that I tend to digress. But I found, I think, 109, might be more, songs with na, na, na in it. Again, na, na is a normal, people la, la, na, na, ooh. But these things were very big in the doo-wop era. And the first records that Paul, I think, Come Go With Me by the Del Vikings is the first record that Paul ever bought as a kid. These songs all had what they call gibberish or nonsense lyrics. So that was all in Paul. And that's why I say Hey Jude is the culmination of everything Paul learned as a songwriter, everything he learned by being in the Beatles, because he was a craftsman, because he was a student. He was a music geek like you and me. And all the people out there who just love music, he loves to celebrate it as much as write it and perform it.
The book, Take a Sad Song, The Emotional Currency of Hey Jude, comes out June 1st. And we're talking with author James Campion. And like you say, Paul calls it magic, the ability to write music. He's been writing since the age of 14. He's still writing music. And as you write about in the book, you think about all the songs he composed or co-wrote with the Beatles. Add those with the solo songs he wrote for other artists. The number of hit singles is staggering. Guinness Book of World Records named him the most successful songwriter of all time. That was in 1979. Throughout your career as an author and a music journalist, you've interviewed many songwriters over the years, I'm assuming. Where do you place Paul on the list of the greatest songwriters? I hate to put you on the spot, but where do you put him?
You have to put him at the top statistically, because what you just read, and I put it in the book, it's mind-numbing. You have to put Paul up there. I mean, for pure structural songwriting, Dylan is a hard one to beat. If you want to go back to Cole Porter, you want to go back to Irving Berlin, if you want to go back to Lieber and Stoller, Carole King and her husband Goffin, and they wrote a lot of songs. So, yeah, I mean, I would put Paul at the top mainly because and let's face it, not even just statistically, he kept going. And if you look at Paul's full canon, I forget who said this recently, but I was listening to either a podcast or a radio show or something. Somebody said it's definitely not in my book, and it's something I originated. But if you look at the full scope, the full arc of Paul's career, it is incredible. At the time, when I was a kid and these records came out, I had Band on the Run 45. Like when these records came out, we was like, oh, this is really great. And then, the critics didn't really like some things. And other things have come back. Like for years, I always loved Ram since the 80s when I was introduced to it. And everybody was pissing on that record. I read the reviews from it and people were like, oh, and I'm like, what am I missing? This record is brilliant. And now everyone's come to Jesus on it and they love it and they should love it. So if you look at everything Paul did through Wings, I mean, think about Wings. They were huge. He did it again. He was the only Beatle to do it again. And he kept doing it, which goes to prove the whole point of his being ambitious or overly pushy in the studio with the Beatles. That was just his way. When John was just kind of doing politics or the occasional song or doing some, performance art with Yoko and then eventually baking bread and raising Sean. And when George did one American tour and was about spirituality and occasionally doing music. And then, and Ringo did stuff when he was having fun. But Paul was busting it and he wanted to be in a band and the band had to have a say. And, so Paul never changed all those years.
He had an album out last year, didn't he?
He did. And he doesn't, McCartney 3. Yeah, he doesn't, and he loves the collab. He loves to collaborate. He loves to be in there. And again, I go back to John and Paul, with their acoustic guitars, as John called it, eyeball to eyeball, writing, these gorgeous songs that would become massive hits and change culture and music forever.
What is it that you feel makes Paul McCartney such an exceptional songwriter?
Well, first of all, as everybody points out in the book, he's a melody machine. And as my friend Adam Duritz says, melody comes from nowhere. Lyrics, you can base on experiences or books you've read, or, we all use the language, whether it's texting or emailing or writing a letter or a note, but not melody. I mean, he's a master melodicist, as Dan Byrne calls him. So there you got that. Secondly, the empathy aspect. I think you really need to feel what the other half is going through to be a great songwriter. And I think the Beatles did that very well, maybe better than everybody else. And people always ask me, I'm a Stones guy in the grand Beatles-Stones argument. But I could see where the Beatles sort of trumped the Stones in that sort of emotional connection. You could see the adoration and why people keep coming back to them in different generations. And there's no way to really tell with the Stones because they keep going, right? So, I mean, they haven't had really a new record of new music the way Paul has, but they're out there almost every summer playing somewhere. Whereas the Beatles have been gone since 1970. John's been gone since 1980. And amazingly, I think George has been gone since the aughts. So, it keeps going. But for Paul, as a songwriter, what makes him great is he's able to tap into those things that people feel. The two most famous records of the Enlightenment period, I like to call it, of music, is Sgt. Pepper's Lonely Hearts Club Band and Dark Side of the Moon, which is the Beatles and Pink Floyd, respectively. Huge, critically acclaimed. Dark Side of the Moon was on the Billboard charts for 50 years, I don't remember. And of course, Sgt. Pepper's blew up the entire concept of music. It was the biggest thing anyone ever did that summer, and it was lauded for many years as the greatest album ever made. Those two records are just about stuff that we do. Getting on the bus, eating Kellogg's cereal, waking up in the morning, seeing your friend, a meter maid, money, breathe, just school. It's just stuff. And for some reason, the Beatles never let, when the Beatles did a psychedelic single that again changed music, Strawberry Fields Forever and Penny Lane. And just like Revolution is John's statement at the B-side of Hey Jude, that's two buddies growing up in Liverpool, writing about Liverpool, about their childhood. Paul is writing about the bustling town and the bustling area of Penny Lane, and John is writing about the Strawberry Field, home for wayward children, or, an orphanage, and then remembering playing there, but then using it as a psychological sort of thing. So Paul could always write about, it doesn't matter how huge he is, how famous he is, how many worlds he's conquered. He's still writing about the guy next door. He's still writing about stubbing your toe. And that's cool, I don't think anybody else does it quite like him, And he's still that boy that discovered music and, it took the pain away. And he loves to share that gift. He loves to do it. Take
a sad song, The Emotional Currency of Hey Jude. It's out June 1st through Backbeat Books. It's available wherever books are sold. You can pre-order through Amazon or just head over to backbeatbooks.com. You can find out all the ways you can get a copy. And James, you have a website.
I do have a website, jamescampion.com. There's an order button there. If you want to order it from me, I will sign it to you. And if you live in the continental USA, I will mail it to you free. So I do sign copies. And again, this is a hardcover first edition, so I don't know how long they're going to last. I highly recommend people do. It's a beautiful, I just got a copy actually this afternoon just for myself to see, and it looks really nice. I know, Eric, you were nice enough to read the review copy on PDF, but they do a nice job with the photographs in there, and it's a fun read. It's not a very long book because it's about one song, but I think you're right. I think everything that everybody added to this book was so unique, and I was learning. That was, if I may say in conclusion, that was my joy, is to learn myself. I wasn't interviewing these people to fill in narratives. Of course, you're doing that as a writer, but I wasn't just merely doing it for that. Please tell me why the Na-Nas work. What is Paul doing here that mesmerized? Why is this number one for 9 weeks, longer than any Beatles song? 19 weeks on the charts, longer than any Beatles song. Why was it number one in more countries than any other Beatles song? Why do we still sing this today? Why is it still relevant today?
That's why I love reading these books, and that's what I get out of doing this podcast. I'm learning things about songs I've listened to a million times, and then you listen to it in a whole different way once you find out some of the information. So the social media, you did say Facebook. Any other social media pages? Where can people find you on Facebook? If they just go there, they just type in your name.
It's Hey Jude Book, Facebook/Hey Jude Book, or James Campion. I think JC-author. It's an author page. I've been on there for years. My Instagram handle is @JamesCampion. My Twitter handle is @FearNoArt. And I'm on all those things. So please follow me. I'll let you know what's going on. There's book events. I'm going to be attending and speaking at the Chicago Beatle Fest in August. I am going to be in Syracuse, which is pretty cool, Eric. I'm going to be in Syracuse when Paul plays Syracuse, and I actually have a signing at the Barnes & Noble there the day Paul McCartney is playing there. So that's kind of neat.
Oh, cool. You going to go see him in concert?
Yes. Yeah. Thanks, my brother-in-law. He got the ticket. So it was actually his idea. He thought it was a great idea because my wife's family is up there. My family, I love them. So, but I mean, she's originally from there. So that's a great idea. So I'm doing a lot of these. I'm going to do one in Raleigh, North Carolina in September with both Dr. Koch and Dr. Boone that we mentioned on this podcast. And I'm going to speak at the college to their classes, and then they're going to join me at the local bookstore there. So please check out the Facebook page, check out my website, and for any of my appearances and all the different podcasts like this one. And Eric, let me tell you, this one was an honor for me. This is an excellent podcast. I do just what you said. I've had some of my friends and colleagues on this show. I have went out and gotten books that you've discussed. I've learned new things about artists.
Yeah, that's what I like to hear. I
applaud you. And I was so glad that my publisher reached out and said you guys were interested, and it's been a real gas speaking to you about all of this. I hope most of it makes it onto the podcast, even though it's kind of long. I thought myself it was a decent conversation we had here. Awesome conversation, man.
Listen, I could talk endlessly about that stuff. I have to have people literally like just kind of remove me from the room when I'm talking about this stuff. So don't worry about that. You can talk about it as long as you want. Yeah, man, this is great. And you have 2 podcasts, which are very cool. People should check out. What are those podcasts?
My podcast with Adam Duritz is the Underwater Sunshine podcast. We have 96, 98 episodes up there. We stopped doing it during the pandemic, but we're thinking about getting back into it. We are going to co-host with our wonderful producers the Underwater Sunshine Festival, which takes place in New York City. And this year it'll be the 11th and 12th of November at Rockwood Music Hall. All different bands of different levels play, and it's free and it's a lot of fun. All the bands come from all over the country, in some cases the world, to play. I've also done a series of podcasts with my singer-songwriter friend who was in the book, Eric Hutchinson. We mentioned him earlier, on all of the songs from his last 3 albums. So actually tomorrow I'm going to be recording the next podcast for a new record he has coming out. So you can find those on Spotify or wherever you listen to podcasts. And I also did a series on YouTube called The Sunshine Spotlight during the pandemic, when all of my friends who are musicians couldn't play. And man, it was devastating for the music community. Devastating. I gave them a voice to ask what they were doing, how they were handling it. And that show became such an education for me, Eric, because I was just totally bowled over by how the pandemic affected people psychologically to be able to create. Some people couldn't, they were like numb for 6 months. Other people went nuts like me and just wrote songs. My friend Elizabeth Zeman from Elizabeth and the Catapult, she wrote this thing called Sincerely E, all about being shut in. Beautiful record, my friend Matt Susage. So I interviewed all of these people over the months to get their thoughts. And I think it's a great series. And if you really love music and musicians and support them, you're going to hear some really great music and learn about musicians that really should be bigger in the pantheon of pop music.
And you can just go to jamescampion.com. You've got the podcast right there, so people can go there. So I'll put the link up on the show notes page. James Campion, man, this was great. Thanks so much.
Thank you so much, and keep up the fine work. I'll be listening, and it's been a real honor to be on the show.
And thanks to you, as always, for listening. I'm Eric Senich. Join me again next time for another brand new episode of Booked on Rock.
That's it. It's in the books.